Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is L. Lauren, and I am the author of the story you're about to listen to. So, this week's story is quite literally right off the press because I finished it last week, edited it this week, and now y'all have it. I have other stories that are in the editing phase, but I was avoiding responsibilities, so here we are. This story is part of a random challenge I've made up for myself called the 10,000 Challenge, and it's basically a goal to write 10 roughly 10,000 word stories as fast as I can. I usually go over about 2,000 words, so they end up being about 12,000 or a little bit over that roughly, but who's counting? Anyway, this week's story is called In Love with My Boss's Bad Boy Son, because we're keeping it simple, and I hate titles. This story also has many of my favorite tropes, including age gap, opposites attract, opposite ends of the track, a bit of protector, a bit of forced proximity, and a sweet happily ever after. I hope you guys enjoy it.
In Love with the Boss's Bad Boy Son. Chapter 1. Hosiah. Hosiah drummed his fingers on the counter as he waited for his coffee machine to finish squeezing the last dregs of juice out of freshly ground coffee beans. It smelled heavenly, but even dark roast Nicaraguan coffee wasn't going to improve his day. He had woken up to 5 missed calls from his boss, 2 from his mother, and 1 from the nursing home where his father lived. He'd responded to the first and the last. His boss had given him a list of errands to complete before he entered the office, and the nursing home wanted to confirm a scheduled payment. He had his list, but he couldn't make any guarantees to the nursing home. The lady on the phone hadn't sounded too pleased with his answer, but she sighed an unwilling acceptance either way. His mother, well, never called wanting anything positive, and it was nearing payday, so he could only guess why his number was on her call list this morning. He poured up his coffee, added a dusting of artificial sweetener and a splash of milk, closed his to-go mug, and left. The errands were menial, but he appreciated them. More errands meant less time at the office, less time managing all the wild emotions Mr. Johnson, Hosiah's boss of nearly 10 years, had. Mr. Johnson owned a luxury real estate development company, and he serviced people who had more money than Hosiah had ever dreamed of. His clients made more money in an hour than Hosiah made in a month. Never mind the clear monetary discrepancy, Mr. Johnson and his clients were beyond privileged and insufferable, and Hosiah could only sit through so many meetings where the biggest problem was how wide the paved driveway was, or a home or vacation property not having the right kind of curtains. Evidently, most of his clients preferred automatic blackout curtains to the more traditional, manual type. Who would have guessed? Hosiah's first stop was collecting Mr. Johnson's dry cleaning, which was fine because he regularly slipped in a couple of his own items, and the dry cleaning clerk much preferred communicating with him instead of Mr. Johnson any day. His next stop was the local bakery, where Mr. Johnson had placed an emergency order for a breakfast spread. He had to wait on this one, but he received a complimentary breakfast sandwich for the trouble. As he sat at one of their 2-person tables, he checked his mother's messages. They were nothing short of the usual. As he deleted them, his phone lit up with a new call, and with gritted teeth he stared at the screen. Through rhythmic buzzing and flashing it read "Mom" in bold white letters. On the 3rd ring, he answered and put the cell phone to his ear. "Mom," he greeted her unceremoniously. "Hi, sweetie. How are you?" He went through the checklist. Was her voice slurring? Did she sound antsy? Sleepy? Hyped up? "I'm fine, Mom," Hosiah resigned. "I'm on my way to work." "Oh, of course. Today is a weekday, isn't it?" "Yep," he sighed, picking at the last half of his breakfast sandwich. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing all right. I slept at the shelter last night and got a good hot meal." "Mom, why didn't you sleep in the hotel I got you last week?" "Oh, I lost the key." Hosiah pressed his lips in a thin line. "What about the clothes I got you?" "What clothes?" "The shoes and pants and shirts, remember? We went to the store together, and I bought you a bunch of things to wear, and then I took you to the hotel so you could rest." "Oh," She was silent on the other end of the line. He should be grateful she still had her cell phone, but she'd never lose it because then she couldn't call asking for money. Hosiah loved his mother, but he surely didn't like her very much. She'd been all right when he was growing up, but somewhere around the time his father got sick, she did too. "Mom, I can't keep. I was wondering if you could spare." Hosiah sighed again. "How much?" "Just a bill. $100? He blinked. "What do you hold on?" He got up and stepped outside. "What do you need $100 for?" "I just have to get some supplies is all. I have to get groceries." "I can buy you groceries tonight," Hosiah challenged. "When I get off, I can get you groceries." No, baby. Don't worry about it. You're going to work all day, and then you'll be tired. I can get them." "Of course you can." Hosiah rolled his eyes. "I don't know if I have $100 right now, Mom. I can wait until Friday." "You get paid this week, don't you?" "I don't know if I'll have it then, either," he said. "Besides, I gave you clothes, food, and a hotel room just last week. I'm not made of money, and I still have to take care of Dad, too." "Norman?" she prompted. "How is he?" "He's not doing well, and you'd know how he was doing if you went to see him." "He doesn't want to see me," she whispered. "Mom, he doesn't remember who you are. The doctor told us this. He's not doing it intentionally. It's part of his illness, and you should go see him." "I can't, I just can't." "Of course you can't. Listen, I have to go in a minute," she added. "Go where?" Hosiah spat. "You're on a phone I pay for, in clothes I paid for, and you're asking me for more money. Is there some mysterious job you have to be at?" "I have to," she started. "You have to what?" Hosiah cut her off, voice raising more than he wanted it to. He didn't like how his mother affected him. He didn't like how he reacted to her, but without fail, she got him to a place he didn't like to be. "Tell me." "Your order for Mr. Johnson is ready." A worker popped their head out of the little bakery, looking squarely and tiredly at Hosiah. "I have to go," he said, ending the call before she asked about the money again. He tucked the sweet-smelling breakfast spread in the back seat of his car and called the nursing home on the way, scheduling a payment at the end of the week for his father's care. Juggling the dry cleaning and his coffee in one hand and the baked goods in another, he shuffled up to the second floor of the building and set his coffee on his desk. He took a moment to gather himself, smoothing over his clothes and raking his fingers through his hair before knocking on his boss's door. "Mr. Moore," Mr. Johnson said as he jerked the door open. His boss always looked impeccably put together, but not today. Today he looked frazzled. "Did you get the breakfast spread and the dry cleaning?" Hosiah presented both. "Good," he adjusted the cufflinks on his blazer. "I need you to do something else for me. It's both important and private. I need you to pick my son up from the airport." "What?" Hosiah blinked. "You can take my car and driver. I will let him know to pick you up." Then Mr. Johnson took both the dry cleaning and the baked goods and closed the door. Chapter 2. Brody. A lifetime of unfortunate events had led him here, at the police station, promising a stranger who barely spoke English that he could absolutely pay him every cent of bail money as soon as he got his one phone call. Hand gestures were involved, alongside slow talking, and eventually, they directed him to a wall-mounted phone, and he dialed the number most likely to reach his father on the first try, his office phone. It rang and Brody closed his eyes. He'd been begging the universe to pardon his mistakes for too long. Perhaps today was the day his lives caught up with him. Cats surely had 9 lives, but the saying wasn't exactly applicable to wealthy children with absent fathers and dead mothers. "This is Johnson," a stern voice answered after the 5th ring. "Dad?" Brody replied before clearing his throat. "Mr. Johnson." "What do you need?" His father sighed. "What sort of trouble are you in now?" "Don't be mad. Everyone's okay. We just got arrested in Mykonos. It was stupid, but they said I could wire them money for the bail, and then I'm free to go. I'm not sure if it's bail exactly. Bail or the fine or whatever. And you're calling me because…" His father's voice was like ice in the dead of winter. There was not even an ounce of warmth, and if there had been, the cold sucked it away. "Because I lost my cards, and I don't have any way to access my account. The money for the fine or bail or whatever should be in there. I just need you or your secretary or someone to call and transfer it. So let me get this straight. You've lost your cards and you've been arrested, and now you need me to transfer the money to get you out of this mess? Please, Dad. Do you think my father built this legacy for his grandson to squander it away on overseas trips, getting drunk with deadbeat college buddies?" Brody sucked in a breath. "No, sir. Do you think I get out of my bed and come to work every morning so I can get calls from my only son, the son my wife sacrificed her life for, saying he's in prison and he needs help? No, sir," Brody said again. "Your mother didn't give her life for you to be a fuck-up. My father didn't build this business from the ground up so you could squander the money away and slander a name you should be proud to have." "I know," Brody whispered, tears stinging his eyes as he glanced around the area. He blinked them back before they fell and gripped the receiver a little tighter. "Will you do it, Dad? It looks like I have no choice. I will also be scheduling the company plane to pick you up presently and bring you back here. The world may give you whatever you want, as long as you have enough money to pay for it, but I won't. Your 5-year probation was dependent on you staying out of trouble, and you've failed it. When you return, you will be on house arrest. I will see to it. Dad. Call me Mr. Johnson. My son died when my wife did." Then the call ended. Brody closed his eyes as he placed the receiver on the hook, and while he had been able to contain his tears before, this time he couldn't. He knew exactly how pathetic he looked, crying by the phone in a foreign police station, but what the hell else was he supposed to do? The tears trickled down burning cheeks, and he was eternally grateful his friends had already posted their fines and left. It took less than a half hour for the station to receive the money, finish the paperwork and release him, but it still took too long. With shame etched on his face and a knot in his throat, he climbed into a car paid for by his father's company and rode to the airport, boarding a private jet also paid for by his father's company. "Hey, Brody," the young flight attendant greeted him, stashing his bags away and ushering him to a seat. He had the pick of the bunch after all, but he usually sat in the middle, and today was no different. "Can I get you anything?" "Something strong, please, and keep them coming." She opened her mouth but then clamped it shut and shook her head. "Okay. You got it." Several hours and countless drinks later, the private jet landed on the runway of his hometown. The place was familiar and foreign to him. He'd grown up in this small little town, but over the years everything had changed. Everything had gradually become more industrial, more built up. When he was younger, the only high-rise building was his father's office. Now high-rise buildings lined the streets like decorative trees. He knocked back his most recent drink, shuddering as the alcohol went through him. Gripping the seat in front of him he stood, and the alcohol knocked him back. The flight attendant was far less than pleased, but he managed to grab his bag and stumble his way off the plane. His father had promised him a ride, and a small part of him hoped his father would actually show up. His mind knew the chances of his father showing up were slim to none, but his heart couldn't help being hopeful. Of course, the hope was dashed when he saw the company car in the parking lot, and the driver taking a smoke break outside. The driver had been in their family for as long as he could remember. The driver was the man who fixed Brody's tie on prom night, and the one giving him terse lectures on what kind of man he wanted to be. "Great," Brody muttered, sobering up just a little bit, but the surprises weren't over. As he got closer to the company car, he spied his father's longtime secretary, and he stopped dead in his tracks. Chapter 3. Hosiah. The last place he wanted to be was at the airport, watching Mr. Johnson's drunk son stumble towards the vehicle. Mr. Johnson and his son shared a name, but they didn't share anything else, especially not work ethic. The problem with Brody was he had everything. He had a father who could give him anything he wanted, a good private school education, the opportunity to go to a prestigious college or university. He had full cupboards, a private jet, and a bank account that topped itself off bi-weekly without Brody having to lift a finger. They may have lived in the same city, but their lives were completely different. Hosiah folded his arms as Brody stumbled over to him. The very worst part about Brody was his charm. He was the textbook lost son, but he had a warm, sunny smile, all-American boy chiseled good looks, and a voice so smooth and buttery a nun would rethink her life choices. It had been a while since Hosiah had seen Brody, but his boss's son had only aged in the positive sense, like wine, and what had been starter locks several years ago now draped Brody's shoulders and traveled down his back. When their eyes met, Hosiah shivered and looked away. If his father had taught him nothing else, he had taught him not to get tangled up with any sort of relationship outside a professional one with your boss, or his family, or even his dog. Brody, whether he was the prodigal lost child or not, surely counted. "Hey there. How are you doing?" Brody greeted him. His words sloshed around like marbles in the mud, and his balance swayed. "Better than you," Hosiah replied. "I'm supposed to be taking you home, but we can stop and get anything you need on the way." "I don't need anything." "Well, nothing you can buy at a store anyway." Brody slapped a hand against the side of the company car and swayed in towards Hosiah. Hosiah smelled the cloying sweetness of the alcohol on Brody's breath, and it churned his stomach. "How unfortunate for you." "It is unfortunate for me. I've had a pretty long flight and an even longer day, and I'd love some help getting settled back into town. You're working for my father, so I'm sure you're in real need of a good time." "Excuse me?" Hosiah lifted both his eyebrows. Brody leaned in. "How about you let your boss know you'll be babysitting me all afternoon?" Hosiah ducked from the trap of Brody's arms. "Is babysitting a grown man supposed to be sexy? I'd rather count the grains of sand on the ocean than spend any length of time with a man who says he needs to be babysat." "Okay, so you're not into younger men then, huh? Too bad." Brody swayed again. At first, he braced himself against the vehicle to come off as appealing. This time he gripped the side of the company car, because otherwise he was headed for the ground. Hosiah ignored the question in favor of opening the car door for Brody, but Brody didn't get inside. "Well," he prompted Hosiah. The smell of alcohol wafted off him with every movement and every breath, and it churned Hosiah's stomach. "If I answer you, will you make this less painful for everyone involved?" "Sure," Brody smirked. "Okay." Hosiah fixed his attention on the other man. Brody was younger, but he did have a few extra inches on him in height, and his shoulders had a few extra inches too. He was strong-built, and Hosiah couldn't say it wasn't a little sexy. "I have no problem with younger men, but I'm not too interested in little boys who play with their daddy's money when the rest of us have to work hard for what we have. Now load up, so I can take you to your mansion-sized apartment." Brody stared at Hosiah, clenching his jaws a moment before doing as he was told. He ducked into the vehicle and reluctantly buckled himself in. Hosiah got in on the other side and did the same, maintaining a healthy distance away from Brody and the hovering stench of liquor. When they arrived at Brody's place, they got out, and Hosiah walked him up to his apartment, unlocking the door and swinging it open. "Here," Hosiah said. Brody had sobered a little more on the drive, and he only stumbled twice on the way up to the apartment's door. He almost walked in a straight line, but every twist and turn and sway angered Hosiah just a little bit more. It wasn't Brody's fault he was born into a life of pure privilege, but it was his for squandering it. Brody breezed past Hosiah into his place and ripped his shirt over his head as soon as he was inside. "You sure I can't offer you anything? A drink, a bite to eat, an hour of fun?" Hosiah blinked. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered and shook his head. "You're vile." "Am I?" Brody looked Hosiah over, lingering at the crotch of his pants before returning to his face. Hosiah's eyebrows lifted and he closed his eyes. "I do not get paid enough for this." "Sleep it off, hotshot," he said, turning on his heels and approaching the door again. Brody chased him. "I'd rather sleep it off with you. I bet you could help me clear my head pretty damn quick." "No thank you," Hosiah growled. Then he stepped outside and slammed the door behind him, clenching his fists at his side. Mr. Johnson was one thing, but his insufferable and privileged son was another. Hosiah understood being a secretary involved performing a lot of various and generally undesirable tasks, but putting up with a drunk rich kid had missed the list. He stalked towards the company car and paced the length of the sidewalk. "I could just quit," he said aloud. "I've spent a decade at this job, and it hasn't gotten any better since I started. I have credentials and a diploma." His cell phone rang, and with a sigh he paused his deliberation and answered it. "Mr. Johnson," he said as he put the cell phone to his ear. "Oh, hi. Is this Mr. Moore?" The person on the other end was certainly not Hosiah's boss. Yes. This is he." "Okay, hi. I'm Kara with Happy Smiles Assisted Living Facility. I was calling about your balance. I called earlier to schedule a payment for Friday, didn't I?" "You did. It's just that we have a policy stating all scheduled payments must be at least 10% of the outstanding balance, which means," she paused, tapping on a keyboard, "the minimum amount you can schedule is $3,233.88. Hosiah choked and sputtered a cough. "I'm sorry. Why couldn't someone tell me this sooner? I apologize for the inconvenience. We've been in the process of transferring systems, and I guess we just didn't notice. Do you want me to go ahead and schedule the payment for you?" Hosiah didn't speak. He could barely afford to pay what he had been paying, but Kara was asking for double the amount. He was sick to his stomach as he turned and peered at Brody's apartment. Inside, Brody was drinking expensive sparkling water and nestling himself into luxury 1,000-thread count sheets. And Hosiah? Well, Hosiah might just be watering down already thin soup to make it last even longer. "Yes," he resigned. "Go ahead and schedule the payment." "No problem. Thanks for trusting us to care for your loved one." The call ended.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the story so far. If you are, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Right now we are just 500 subscribers away from 3,000, and I would love to hit that before my birthday in March. So if you can give me a hand, that would be great. And back to the story.
Chapter 4. Hosiah. He had a little time left at the office after he deposited Brody off at his apartment, and he was grateful for it. He reveled in the mundane tasks of organizing emails and sorting work orders. When 5 o'clock rolled around, he sent his boss a text message, letting him know the state of various projects, and then he shut everything down for the day. Hosiah walked out of the office and took a deep breath of the breezy afternoon air as he strolled through the parking lot to his personal vehicle. Taking the company car during work hours was certainly fun, but he melted into the worn fabric seat of his old sedan. He remembered the day he purchased the car. A few months after working for Mr. Johnson, he had finally squirreled away enough cash for a healthy down payment and enough days to confirm gainful employment. He had wanted a sturdy car, not a looker but something to last, and he'd gotten it. This sedan had carried him through several relationships, taken him across the country on casual road trips, and had even proved to be a reliable city car. Now, this old sedan carted him over to the nursing home where it had helped move his father in several years ago. He pulled into the paved parking lot and went inside, nodding to the front desk staff and beelining to his father's room. He knocked first and then let himself in. "Who is it?" his father asked, voice rattling as he looked up from a patterned rocking chair in the leftmost corner of the room. "It's me, Hosiah, your favorite son," he teased, closing the door behind him and surveying the room. He adjusted a few pictures on the wall, aligning them until their lines were perfectly parallel and perpendicular, and then ventured further in. The TV whispered, and Hosiah looked around for a seat. "Oh, Hosiah," his father smiled. "You're on a break from college? How are your studies going?" Hosiah sighed, forcing a smile to his face. "Yeah, Dad. I'm on a break from school. My literature professor is giving me a bit of trouble, but I think I'm doing okay otherwise." "I'm sorry to hear," his father said, smoothing the blanket over his skinny legs. He had been a powerful man in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, but time and age shrank him. "I've always loved literature. Tell me what you're studying in class. Maybe your old man can help." With no other seats available, Hosiah sat on the corner of his father's bed, playing with stray threads from the comforter as he conjured up something for his father. "We're studying fables and the hidden meanings and lessons inside of them." "Oh?" His father lifted feathery gray brows. "Which fables?" "Well, this week we focused on The Little Mermaid." His father nodded. "It's a good one, and there are so many themes." The old man's face brightened. "Did you know Hans Christian Andersen was deeply religious? In some ways, he felt The Little Mermaid's fate was a punishment for straying from obedience and expressing sexual curiosities." "Really?" Hosiah tilted his head. "Yes, indeed," his father said, and then continued on his explanation. His father lit up when he talked of literature, and his brain was as sharp as a tack. Growing up, Hosiah had always been a practical kid. He had never gotten excited for analysis or things with muddy explanations. He preferred clear and unambiguous subjects like math and science, but his father had always been a creative mind. Given two entirely unrelated subjects, he could still weave them together as if the original creators had meant to. Now, with his father's health fading and his mind fading just as fast, Hosiah enjoyed this side of things. He enjoyed hearing his father speak about old literature, whether it was poems or parables. He enjoyed seeing the lines of age fade away as his father spoke, enraptured with an idea he had to see to the end. He stayed with his father through dinner time, leaving once the nurses came in for his nightly routine. He squeezed his father in a hug, kissed his forehead, and promised to visit again as soon as he could. Then he left, or at least he left his father's line of sight, and hung in the shallow hallway towards the door, watching two gentle nurses change his clothes and coax him into bed. He hugged himself around the middle and sighed, leaving the room behind the nurses. The cell phone service was notoriously bad inside the nursing home, so as soon as he stepped outside, a flood of messages came through. Most of them were from his best friend, Luna. They had started calm and reasonable, and ended with all caps demands for him to call her at his very earliest convenience. She meant right then. Laughing, he slipped inside his vehicle and called his best friend. She answered on the first ring. "How could you not tell me?" she cried. "Tell you what?" "How could you not tell me your boss's son was in town?" "Well," Hosiah smacked his lips together, "partially because I didn't know he was coming into town until this morning." "How do you know he's in town?" "He's been posting on his social media constantly, and you can see the geolocation. Plus, he hinted." Hosiah rolled his eyes. "Hinted what?" "He hinted about his location. It's nothing serious, he just likes to tease his followers. He also dropped hints about meeting a sexy stranger." "Whoever could it be?" Hosiah muttered, far less excited than his best friend. Luna was quiet for a few moments, and then she gave a long-suffering sigh. "Why are you like this?" "Like what?" "Unimpressed by trust fund babies?" "Like," she sighed, immune to just enjoying anything. "He's cute. You were in the car with him, and you got to drop him off. So many people would have killed to be in your position. So sorry for them. He's an ass." "Of course he is," Luna laughed. "But he's an exceptionally hot one." "Okay," Hosiah grunted. "Do you still want to meet for hump day happy hour, or no?" At Daisy Duke's bar right around the corner from your dad's nursing home. It's the only one we're going to make at this point, since it ends at 9. Yeah, Daisy Duke's. Yes, I thought you'd never ask. Her voice became honey-sweet, and then she giggled. I'll see you in a few. Order my usual. Yeah, sure, Hosiah chuckled. See you shortly. Chapter 5. Brody. Brody's pounding headache was persistent, even after drinking 2 bottles of water and eating a relatively balanced breakfast. The only thing worse than his pounding headache was the slow return of his memory, and just how stupid he'd been when he met his father's secretary the previous day. He remembered his father's secretary from when he was graduating high school. It was the secretary who delivered his tuxedo and helped him get dressed, and back then the age difference felt colossal. The secretary was an elusive older man, more exclusive, more outside the ranges of acceptability, but now Brody was older too. The secretary was, too, but a couple years felt different in your mid-20s as opposed to fresh out of high school. He cracked open a 3rd bottle of water as the doorbell sounded through the apartment. Assuming it was one of his friends from the previous night, he groaned and answered the door. Man, last night was crazy, he said as the door swung open, and when his gaze landed on the person standing behind it, his breath hitched. I bet it was, his father's secretary said, glaring at him all the while. His name was Hosiah. Good morning, Brody replied. I didn't expect you over. Do you need anything? Your father sent me over to check on you. Hosiah tilted his head. He thinks you're incapable of finding yourself breakfast, much less anything else, but it looks like you did the first one. I ordered something, yeah, Brody explained, rubbing the back of his neck. I was thinking about getting some groceries ordered next. Well, good, because I have a lot to do today, and a grown man getting his own groceries is a real help, Hosiah snapped back, eyes narrowed at Brody. He opened his mouth, sucking in a breath, but then he shook his head. It's not even worth my time. You are not worth my time. Brody blinked. Hosiah wasn't his father. They didn't have any sort of history, but his comment made years of frustration bubble inside the pit of Brody's stomach. You don't know me, Brody shot back. Look, I'm sorry for yesterday. I really am. I was drunk and stupid and you didn't deserve any of it, but you don't know me. Hosiah glared at him. Do you think you're some enigma wrapped in mysteries and covered with a dazzling smile and dark brooding eyes? You're not so difficult to figure out. You're a trust fund baby with too much time on his hands and too much money to his name, and I have things to do today because I have bills to pay and a job to keep. If you can get your own groceries, good. Then I will be on my way. What's on your list? What? Hosiah's voice had slowly escalated, but Brody's question knocked him back down to baseline. What's on your list? If you have a lot to get done, then let me help you. Hosiah pressed his lips together before digging his cell phone out of his pocket and running down his to-do list. Brody stared at the wall as he listened, breaking the list into categories as Hosiah spoke. All right. You know I can't leave here, so let me do all the calling while you take the company car to the local businesses and finish finalizing their deliveries for the next couple open houses. You said also you had some checkout inspections to complete? Why yes, Hosiah replied. Depending on the time frame, I can complete them virtually, just letting them walk through the house on camera, and they can drop the keys here. How does all this sound? Hosiah hadn't looked away from Brody, and his expression was unreadable. Brody cleared his throat. So, how does this all sound? You sound like your father, Hosiah whispered. But otherwise it sounds good. Well, okay. Brody frowned. I will log into the system from here and gather your call list. Let me know in a couple hours how you are doing with the errands. Okay, Hosiah breathed, more a whisper than speech. Cool. Brody's lips tugged into a little smile as Hosiah backed off his porch and wandered back to the company car. He nodded to the driver, who gave a half-wave before disappearing into the driver's seat again. Calling the business's clients was nothing for him. After he finished a third bottle of water and took a shower, he sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad on one side and an electronic tablet on the other. The call list was extensive, but Brody worked through it. As a bonus, many of the clients appreciated hearing from the boss's son or the technical vice president of the company. The biggest surprise for Brody was how much he enjoyed interacting with the clients too. Some were older clients who his father had worked with for years, and others were prospective new clients taking the leap into vacation real estate or commercial real estate. Some wanted advice on possible avenues and locations, and others wanted to be verbally walked through the process. By the afternoon, Brody had completed the list, soothed worried clients, and even closed a few deals. Then he texted Hosiah, who still had a few errands left. Brody took over the walkthroughs and had the clients deliver the keys to his residence, and at the end of the workday he called Hosiah. "Hello," Hosiah answered on the second ring. "Hey, it's Brody." "Oh," Hosiah paused. "Thank you for your help today." "You're welcome. I was wondering if you would mind picking up some food if I place the order." Hosiah started. "Sure. I guess I can." "All right. Well, do you like Chinese food?" "I do." "Cool," Brody smiled. "Text me your usual, and I'll get something ordered up." Before Hosiah could protest, Brody ended the call and waited. Minutes later, he got Hosiah's order, and about an hour later, his doorbell rang again. It was Hosiah and the Chinese food. With a smile, Brody led him inside and offered him a seat as he unpacked their meals. "How were the errands?" Brody asked. "Long but otherwise okay," Hosiah started. "Thank you for helping me." "You're welcome. It was kind of nice to connect with the clients. I'm sure they enjoyed talking to you. I'm not so good at that end of the job. I originally took the position because I enjoy interior design, but the fun of designing the spaces gets lost under all the administrative work." "I understand what you mean," Brody said, spooning food onto a plate. "Today was one of the first days in a while where I've been able to enjoy those aspects again. So thank you." "You're welcome. I think we make a pretty good team." Brody smirked. "Maybe." Hosiah chuckled. "Maybe." Still smirking, Brody placed a plate of food and a bottle of water in front of Hosiah and did the same for himself, sitting across from the other man. They ate in a comfortable and satisfied silence. Halfway through the meal, the doorbell rang and Brody frowned. "Who is it?" Hosiah asked, tapping his chopsticks against his plate. I don't know." Frowning, Brody got up and approached the door. He unlocked it and then, helped by exterior forces, the door flew open. A flood of people came inside, complete with drinks and music. "Hey, Big B." Chapter 6. Hosiah. One moment it was just them, and the next a dozen people had flooded into Brody's apartment. Brody didn't tell them no. Instead, he laughed and joked with them as they set up the scene for the night. Hosiah lingered in the kitchen, watching the boys in the other room. He'd never been a drinker or a partier. He'd never fit in with the party scene. He had always been on the sidelines, whether it was at high school football games or when he had attended college classes. He was the one at home preparing for the next week, not the one downing weak beer until the sun came up. Hosiah was an alien watching the lives of rich 20-somethings like a documentary, and once Brody had settled his friends, he dipped back into the kitchen, smiling. "I'm so sorry, man," Brody said, rubbing the back of his head. "They just appeared and are trying to give me a welcome home party." He hiked his thumb behind him, adding confirmation to his words, but Hosiah wasn't impressed. He couldn't quite decide how he was feeling. On the one hand, anger surely bubbled inside him, and jealousy made its own ugly appearance. Had he, for a moment, thought he would be the focus of someone's attention? His cheeks burned with his own foolishness. "It's fine. I should probably go," Hosiah whispered, peering into the other room as Brody's rowdy friends passed around fresh drinks. You should go join your friends. Brody frowned. You can stay, you know. I can get you a drink if you want one. Hosiah shook his head. No thank you. I think I'd rather go home than party with your friends. He pushed his plate away, even though his stomach protested, and stood. I appreciated your help today, though. I can't thank you enough for helping me get through all my work. Yeah, Brody replied. His shoulders sagged. Yeah, Hosiah agreed, forcing a smile to his face. I will see you then. He sped towards the door, keeping his head down as he shuffled out of Brody's place. Hosiah stopped by his favorite fast food joint before pulling into the parking lot of his apartment complex. With emotions still sensitive, he relaxed inside his vehicle and ate. First he ate the piping hot fries, then the mystery chicken nuggets, and finally, after removing the sliced pickles, he ate the burger. Last he sipped watery tea. When his food had settled, he dragged himself out of his car and to his place, digging around his pockets for his apartment key. My baby, a familiar voice said, and his emotions lit up again. Unlike with Brody, he knew exactly how he was feeling. It was anger. Mom, Hosiah hissed. What are you doing here? I wanted to see you, Hosiah's mother rasped, approaching him with skinny, outstretched arms. He clenched his jaws to avoid wrinkling his face at the chemical scent wafting off her. It was the most noticeable, but the smell of the streets was a close second. Well, you've seen me, Hosiah replied, frozen in his spot as his mother continued her advance. Now Brody's party didn't seem half bad, and he wished he could backtrack his steps and suffer through the party instead. She drowned him in a hug, and when she pulled away, her stench clung to his clothes. He, for a moment, considered burning his outfit, but as tempting as burning it was, soap and water would do the job just as well with far less destruction. I don't have any money for you, Hosiah said. Everything is going to pay for Dad's care. Norman, she whispered, already dark eyes turning coal black at the mention of her husband. How is he? Fine, but he'd be better if the love of his life would go see him. I can't, she whispered. Mentioning his father always had a way of sobering her up, and while Hosiah was grateful it did, he was also resentful too. His mother chose to keep drugs a part of her life at the expense of both her husband and her son. She chose to be an added expense and an added worry in Hosiah's life instead of being a comfort or a safe space like other people's parents were. Even Luna, as independent as she was, could call her parents and receive unfaltering support. Brody's support wasn't unfaltering, but it was still there. Hosiah, however, had a whole different situation. He could forgive his father because no one asked for expedited cognitive decline, but he couldn't forgive his mother. No matter how much therapy he attended or piecework he tried, his anger didn't subside. Every day she picked a life of drug use and homelessness over her family, and she had been choosing the streets over her family since his father had become noticeably ill. Of course you can't, Hosiah sneered. You've made sure of it. I'm sorry, my Hosiah bun, I never. Look, Mom. I've had a long day, and I can't handle this right now. I don't have any money for you, so if money is all you need, you're going to have to rob a bank because I don't have it. Not even $20? Hosiah stared at his mother. Not even $5, she amended, looking right back at Hosiah with not an ounce of shame. Not even $5, he said finally. At this point, the apartment security guard had made it back around to Hosiah's door and approached. Afternoon, sir, he nodded to Hosiah, then he looked at Hosiah's mother. Is everything all right over here? Everything's fine. She was just leaving, Hosiah cut in, smiling towards the security guard, who was several decades his senior and more of an uncle than a paid worker. Ma'am, the guard said. I can escort you off the premises. What are you talking about? This is my son. I have a right to be here and talk to my son. Good night, Mom, Hosiah said, keeping his voice honey-sweet even though he was seething on the inside. He didn't like his mother. No, he hated her. The security guard inserted himself between them, blocking her path to Hosiah as Hosiah continued to his door, unlocked it, and then stepped inside, slamming it behind him. The guard and his mother bickered in the hallway, but Hosiah breathed a sigh of relief as her voice started to fade. Chapter 7. Brody. The party didn't feel the same. The alcohol turned to ash in his mouth, and the music sounded like noise a child would play on pots and pans in the kitchen. He never thought he'd tire of it, but he had. The drinking and partying held little interest for him, and the hours dragged by once Hosiah left. He couldn't even get Hosiah out of his mind, and part of him wanted to drink just to sleep until the next morning, but he fought it, despite dozens of offered drinks. He sent his friends home as soon as the clock struck midnight, when their protest had been the weakest, and collapsed in bed barely 30 minutes later, staring at the ceiling and trying to come up with the best apology for Hosiah the next day. The next day, Friday, came way too soon, and he groaned when the morning light spilled into the room. It was barely 7 o'clock, but his dread at facing Hosiah had manifested in an exhaustion deep in his bones. When it came to his father, he'd never cared. In fact, they were likely due for another screaming match very soon. His father had no expectations of him, so he had no reason to try. Hosiah was different. Hosiah didn't really know him, not in the capacity a family member or best friend would have. He could be anything with Hosiah, and what he wanted to be was a better person, or at least a person Hosiah didn't sneer at every time their eyes met. He showered, dressed, and waited, listening for his father's company car and stalking the time. When he heard it, he bolted to the front door, opening it before Hosiah made it to the steps. "Hey. I'm sorry about last night," Brody blurted out, still gripping the door. Hosiah looked at him, taking a deep breath. "Good for you," he sighed. "What?" Brody blinked. "Good for you. I mean, it's great you know how to say you're sorry." "It's fantastic," Hosiah hissed. "Okay," Brody frowned. "I'm just saying, I didn't mean for them to come over, and I'm sorry about it. I sent them home as soon as I could, and I didn't drink." "Well, I'm not your father, so I don't care what you do or don't do with your time." Brody scoffed. "My father doesn't care either, if we're being real here." Hosiah glared at him. "Right? Well, I'm here to make sure you're doing all right, and then I have work to do." "Can I help you with it?" Brody offered. "No," Hosiah replied. "I'll be able to handle it on my own. Thank you for the offer." He stepped inside Brody's apartment and strolled around it, checking the rooms as if Brody was under inspection. Brody rolled his eyes and then sighed. "Fine. What do I have to do to make it up to you?" "What are you talking about?" Hosiah peeked into the kitchen, gazing around it. "What do I have to do for you to quit looking at me like I'm less than the scum off your shoes?" "Excuse me?" Hosiah arched an eyebrow. "I didn't stutter, did I?" Brody folded his arms as Hosiah checked the pantry. "You didn't, but what makes you think I think you're a piece of shit?" "The way you're acting right now. The way I'm acting to a grown man who's on house arrest and whose father can't trust to get himself out of bed each day?" Brody snarled. "Leave my father out of it. This is between you and me." "Fine," Hosiah snapped back, closing the pantry door and putting Brody in his crosshairs. "I don't know if there's anything you can do to make me change my opinion of you. I've given you chances, and you confirm who you are each time. Maybe you are good at your father's work and highly charismatic, but you're still a fun-loving, carefree party boy at heart, and it's tiresome and pathetic. You don't know me well enough to know what I am. I know you well enough to know if your friends popped up right now, you'd let them straight in, and let them continue ruling your time and your life. So maybe you're not a carefree party boy. You're a weak pushover instead." Brody blinked and winced at Hosiah's words, stunned into silence by them. "I'm tired of guys like you," Hosiah continued, stomping towards the broom closet and opening it next. It was empty. Guys who have everything in the world thrown at their feet and still want more. You could have any guy or girl you want, and yet you insist on pestering me. We are not alike. We will never be alike, and some things aren't meant to mix. You're not even trying to give me a chance. Brody finally found his words. You have this preconceived notion of me, and you operate within it every time. I'm sorry you don't like my friends, or you think they're childish. Maybe they are, but... A cell phone rang. Brody's words cut off, and Hosiah dug into his pockets, pulling out his cell phone, glimpsing the number, and then immediately putting the cell phone to his ear. Hello. His anger flipped to concern in seconds flat. Oh my God. Oh my God. What's going on? Brody asked. Hosiah shook his head as he crumpled to the ground, squeezing the cell phone to his face. Oh my God. Frowning, Brody crossed the room to Hosiah, fished the cell phone from his hands and put it to his ear. This is Vincent Ambrose Johnson III, he said because his name carried some weight and it cut right to the point. What's going on? Hello, the woman on the other end of the line stammered. I was just informing Mr. Moore his payment for $3,233.88 didn't go through, and his father had a little accident this morning. He was admitted to the hospital and is currently in the ICU. Oh my God, Hosiah whispered, covering his face with his hands as tears streamed down his cheeks. We are on our way. Brody ended the call, handed Hosiah his cell phone, and then grabbed his jacket and a pair of shoes. He was still in his lounge clothes, but it didn't matter. We'll take my car since this is personal business, and I don't want my father to have words later. Hosiah stumbled to his feet with a nod, and Brody led him to a detached garage, where they climbed into a modestly priced luxury car and raced to the hospital. Brody parked, walked Hosiah inside, and led him to his father's room. I'll wait out here, Brody whispered to Hosiah. No, Hosiah said before the words had fully left Brody's mouth. He grabbed Brody's sleeve. Come in with me, please. I can't go in there by myself. Okay, Brody sighed and went into the room with Hosiah. The dad? Hosiah ventured. The older man cracked his eyes open. Hosiah? Yeah, it's me and I brought someone with me. This is Brody. Brody stepped forward and touched a hand to Hosiah's father's shoulder. Hello, Mr. Moore. You've got a fine son here. I wish I were half as good as he is. Hosiah blushed. Brody, Hosiah's father rolled the name on his tongue. Yeah, Brody. It's a nickname because my father and I have the same name, he explained, crouching beside the older man and talking in a gentle, soothing tone. He'd never really been around old people or sick people, and he couldn't explain the shift in his mind. He had the utmost respect for Hosiah's father, and even more respect for Hosiah for taking care of his father. You're a junior, Hosiah's father rasped. Technically, I'm a third. Vincent Ambrose Johnson III. Oh, what have I done to deserve your counsel today? The old man teased. You raised a good man who cares for you, Brody explained. Your son loves you very much, you know it, don't you? Hosiah wiped tears from his eyes again, and spoke to the nurse while Brody talked to his father. Brody overheard a few words, including dehydration, falling, and cognitive decline, but he kept his focus on Hosiah's father, engaging him in light and fun conversation. Chapter 8. Hosiah. They stayed at the hospital until nearly midnight, until Hosiah's father was fast asleep, and his vitals had stabilized enough for Hosiah's comfort. Then Brody drove Hosiah home. Hosiah's place was nothing like Brody's, and even Brody's modest sports car pulling into the apartment complex looked out of place. Hosiah held his breath as he directed Brody around to his building, and when Brody pulled into a parking space and killed the engine, Hosiah sighed. Thank you for everything today. You're welcome. Brody smiled. Hosiah looked at his building, and looked at Brody as a blush crept onto his face. Would you like to walk me up? Sure. Brody's smile turned into a grin, and he jumped out of the vehicle, waiting on the sidewalk for Hosiah to join him. Though it was dark, Brody managed to find the light, and Hosiah got a good look at him. He'd seen Brody, of course, nearly every day for the past week, on billboards and even in a few pictures in his boss's office, but he had never gotten an honest look at him. Watching him, bathed in moonlight, gave Hosiah a different picture of Brody, the version of Brody most people never got to see. And he was breathtaking. Hosiah understood his dark, brooding gaze and his lopsided, boyish smile. He wanted that gaze on him all the time, and he didn't want to share the smile either. When he finally met Brody on the sidewalk, he had a whole new set of needs only the other man could satisfy, and each step taken toward his apartment reminded him of just how long it had been since he'd been with another person. It had been an eternity since he'd lost himself in someone else, even longer since he'd wanted to, but right now all he wanted was Brody. He dug his keys out of his pocket and fumbled with them, unlocking the door by a miracle and letting it swing open before he stepped inside. Brody stayed across the threshold, tucking his hands in his pockets. "So, Brody started, "I'm going to be in a world of trouble tomorrow, but I'm glad your father's okay, and I'm glad you're okay." "My father is okay, yeah," Hosiah agreed, "but there's one last thing you can help me with." "Sure," Brody said. "What is it?" "I want you to put me to bed," Hosiah breathed, studying the ground before hazarding a gaze up to Brody's face. A question mark shined on Brody's face at first, but once he looked Hosiah over, he closed his eyes in a groan. "Oh," he sighed, "yeah, I can put you to bed." He stepped past the threshold and let the door swing closed behind him. Hosiah's heart galloped in his chest. The process wasn't new to him, but being with a younger man, a richer man, a man potentially more experienced than him too was. Brody touched Hosiah's chin, lifting it enough for their lips to meet. The kiss was soft and surprisingly gentle, and Brody followed it with an equally soft one before he moved on, kissing the corner of Hosiah's lips, then his jawline and further down. Flushed, Hosiah submitted to him, tilting his head to the side and exposing his neck. We should go to my bedroom," he suggested as Brody tugged at the hem of his shirt. "We will," Brody promised. Hosiah's shirt came off first, then his pants, and then he was bare and exposed for Brody. All of him. "Oh, okay," Hosiah breathed. His first inclination was to cover up, but as he searched the front room, Brody closed the distance between them again and rested a hand on his side. "I like this," Brody whispered. "I like you." With another kiss, this one much hungrier than the first, Brody led them to Hosiah's bedroom, shedding his own clothes on the way. "I like you too," Hosiah murmured. His words were barely above a whisper, as he watched Brody move around his room. The younger man approached the bed and pulled back the sheets before motioning for Hosiah to join him. There was some innocence to it Hosiah hadn't been expecting. They were both naked, both excited for the other person, and they both knew what happened next, but Brody changed the script and Hosiah was in no place to protest. When he made the offer, he hadn't known what to expect. Perhaps a quick subpar fuck. Perhaps nothing at all, but he hadn't expected so much sweetness. "Are you going to join me?" Brody asked, sitting on the edge of Hosiah's bed. "Yes." On shaky legs, Hosiah approached the bed, smoothed his fingers over his well-used sheets and comforter, and then sat down. The set had done well for him, but 200 thread count was nothing more than a coarse grade of sandpaper to a rich man. As Hosiah fretted over his cheap sheets, even cheaper pillows and mostly bare room, Brody settled them. He tucked himself into the bed, and then pulled Hosiah into him, wrapping one strong arm across his lean torso. "Is this what you imagined?" Brody whispered against his neck, sending chills all through his body. "No," Hosiah confessed. "I don't think I expected you to agree." Brody chuckled. "Why wouldn't I agree?" He accented his words with a little kiss to Hosiah's shrugging shoulder. "I don't know. It's Friday. I figured you had plans." "Yeah," Brody chuckled. "You know being on house arrest tends to clear those out." "Speaking of money." "We weren't speaking of money," Hosiah cut in. "Yeah, I wanted to tell you I paid up your father's balance at the nursing home and for the rest of the year." Hosiah closed his eyes, and before he could even get a word out of his mouth, he was crying. "You shouldn't have done it," he mumbled through unflattering sobs. Why not? I had the money lying around. The options were spend it on your father or spend it on a night with the boys. Hosiah wiped his face, trying desperately to suck back his tears, but he couldn't. Just like when he had invited Brody in, he wasn't entirely sure why he was crying. He had dreamed about meeting a man who could free him of the lower-class hamster wheel, but it had been nothing more than a dream. He hadn't processed the reality. You shouldn't have done it, Hosiah choked out, rejecting Brody in one way even as he burrowed deeper into his body, nuzzling his wet face into Brody's strong arms. And they shouldn't charge so much for a necessity. End-of-life care should be a basic right, Brody grunted. Look, just take the gift. I'm sure you'll have plenty of things to dislike me for later. I don't dislike you, Hosiah whispered, twisting his body to face Brody. I judged you before based on my own thoughts, and it wasn't fair. No, it was fair. I was screwing up things, throwing my life and my father's money away with no regard to how others live. I was being selfish. One good act doesn't change a person, Hosiah whispered, venturing a gaze up at Brody. I know, he smiled, which is why I'm probably going to be calling on your help a lot more in the next year, because when I leave here, I'm going to talk to my parole officer about why I broke parole and the right steps to remedy it. I'm going to request community service, and no option to shorten what I owe to society. Hosiah watched him. Okay. So, it was Brody's turn to blush. When you said put you to bed, did you mean this or actual fucking? I wasn't sure. Hosiah chuckled. The second one. He stretched onto his back. But I'm not as young as you. I will need a little help getting the motor started, so to speak. Chapter 9. Brody. Brody was shocked into silence when Hosiah was so forward about his desires, but it thrilled him too. And he readily obliged without much debate. He'd wanted Hosiah since the day he laid eyes on him, and he was as beautiful without clothes on as he was with them. He was exquisite and sexy in everything he did, from his frustrated squirming to his guttural moans, and Brody reveled in it all. He tasted Hosiah first, and then he drove them both home with a hard and fast fuck, panting as he collapsed back in the bed. Hosiah chuckled. I'm still hungry, he whispered as he shifted around on the bed, slithering on top of Brody and grinding himself against him. Brody groaned and gripped the bunched bedsheets at Hosiah's tees, but his youth favored him because, if nothing else, he was quickly at attention for another round. This time Hosiah had the reins, and Brody was at his mercy. He held Hosiah's hips as he rolled them and ground them and took everything he wanted, exploding on Brody's belly after a half hour of hitting just the right spot. When Hosiah threw his head back in a moan and gripped Brody's hands, Brody matched him and filled him a second time. Fuck, Brody groaned, taking over and idly moving Hosiah's hips as the last dregs of pleasure filtered through both of them. Hosiah exhaled a breathy laugh, rubbing flushed cheeks against his own shoulder. Sorry. It's been a while. I'm not complaining. Good. Then Hosiah finally relaxed beside him again. I want you to know I'm satisfied now, but once I've slept my appetite will be back. Groaning, Brody held him close. I'll remember that. It didn't take long for Hosiah's breath to slow, and Brody wasn't far behind him. He held Hosiah close as they both drifted off. They woke up the next morning, in the same position. Brody brushed his fingers over Hosiah's forehead and through his hair before pressing a kiss into his temple. Staying true to his threat, Hosiah squeezed one more round out of Brody before they dragged themselves out of bed. While Hosiah showered, Brody made coffee and scheduled an immediate meeting with his father and parole officer. With a reluctant kiss, Brody left once Hosiah exited the shower. The drive was only 15 minutes, but it felt much longer as he ran through explanations for his behavior. Usually he had excuses, but this time everything was honest. He had rushed Hosiah to the hospital. It had been an emergency. He hadn't been partying or drinking or otherwise bending the rules of the law in his favor. During the few minutes before the meeting, he showered, combed through his locks, and put on the dust-covered suit his father had purchased for him at his high school graduation. It still fit like a glove, custom-tailored and one of a kind. He hadn't worn it since he walked down the aisle then, but putting it on now reminded him of the person he had been. Hopeful and positive, excited for his future. This Brody had wanted to take over his father's company, to make his mother proud, to do something more than drink and smoke away his money. Half a decade of life had happened between this Brody and the Brody he was when he'd stepped off the plane not even a week ago, but he wanted to be this guy again. He adjusted the tie on his neck and then jogged to the door as the doorbell rang, letting his father and his parole officer inside. "Mr. Johnson," Brody greeted his father. Then he nodded to the officer. "Officer Carter." "Brody," his father replied, stepping inside and adjusting the sleeves of his jacket. "You wanted to speak with us today?" "Yes, sir." He took in a deep breath, let it out, and then spilled everything. He explained how he broke the terms of his house arrest last night, driving Hosiah to the hospital. He talked about Hosiah's sick father and the expenses he'd incurred with the nursing home. He explained, then he took Hosiah home and stayed with him the entire night to make sure he was okay. Before either of the older men could say anything, he continued on about what he'd learned and how he wanted to be better and different. He wanted to take over his father's business, to continue what his father had spent his life working on. He also wanted to repay his debts to society. He didn't want his last name and his bank account to affect the way he was reprimanded. Under his father's discerning gaze, he still didn't stop there. He talked about Hosiah's father and the hospital, and all of his mixed emotions concerning his father's real estate business, his inadequacies, and how he'd never fully dealt with his mother's death. He admitted outright and plainly that he hadn't gotten over it. And by his assessment, his father hadn't either. He didn't know how long he spoke or even how much he confessed, but by the time he stopped talking, he was panting and tears streamed down his face. He wiped them away and took in deep, steadying breaths as he looked at his father and the parole officer. "Brody," his father started, but a knock against the living room door frame grabbed their attention. "I hope I'm not intruding," Hosiah said. Brody's heart flipped. "No, Mr. Moore, you're not interrupting anything," Brody's father said. "My son just agreed to apprentice with me full-time to learn the ins and outs of the business and has agreed to 1,000 hours of community service to be completed within the next 12 months. The parole officer nodded his agreement. Brody kept the shock off his face as he nodded as well. "I hope you have a good rest of your weekend, Brody, and I will see you at the office on Monday morning. I hope your father is doing better, Mr. Moore." With that, his father adjusted the buttons of his jacket and left. "Mr. Johnson," the officer nodded to Brody. "We'll be in touch." Then he found the exit as well, leaving Brody and Hosiah in Brody's living room. "What's going on?" Hosiah lifted his eyebrows. "I had a meeting with my father and parole officer," Brody approached Hosiah, "and I told them everything." "Everything?" Brody nodded. "Yeah." "Why?" "I don't understand." "I told them everything because," he sighed, "I like you. I like you a lot, and I want to be the kind of man you'd be proud of." Hosiah searched Brody's face, the confusion still flickering in his eyes. "I don't." "Look. This may sound stupid or foolish or young, I don't know, but I love you. My mom and dad fell in love at first sight when they were in college, and I didn't believe love at first sight existed until I met you. I want to be a man who deserves your time and attention, and I'm going to work at it." "Oh," Hosiah breathed, eyes widening at Brody's confession. "Okay. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. I just wanted you to know." "Okay," Hosiah said again, cheeks warming with a blush. "I love you too," he sighed, stepping closer and kissing Brody. Epilogue. 12 months later. Hosiah. Hosiah stepped into his father's room at the nursing home, smiling as he laid eyes on the older man. His father had been doing well for the last year. Hosiah was sure not having to worry about funds was one reason, getting better care was another, and more frequent visits from Hosiah and also Brody was a third. Today Hosiah came in alone, and the disappointment showed on his father's face. "Wow," Hosiah laughed, "tell me your favorite kid without telling me your favorite kid." "You are my son," his dad smiled, "but if I had another son I'd like one like Brody." "I don't think you get additional sons as you get older. It's not how things work." "Oh?" His father lifted his eyebrows. "Unless you know something I don't know," Hosiah added. He knew cognitive decline didn't go backward, but for whatever reason, it surely hadn't gone forward either. Most days his father was present, looking forward to their visits, remembering the days of the week, and even thinking of topics to discuss with Brody, his all-time favorite conversationalist. For hours on the weekend, the three of them would hang out at the nursing home, watching television, playing cards, and just talking. Hosiah was partially convinced Brody knew his father better than he did, but he wasn't sad about it either. He was glad they got along, glad he could trust Brody with someone as precious to him as his father. "Oh well," his father crossed his arms, "I suppose there are ways." There was a knock at the door before Hosiah could respond, and a nurse popped her head inside. "Hello, Mr. Moore," she smiled at Hosiah's father. "You've got another visitor. Is it okay if I let them in?" "Brody's parole meeting must have ended early," Hosiah said as he jumped to his feet. Right. Today is Friday." Hosiah nodded. "A lucky Friday too, because we're taking you home for the weekend." "Your doctor approved it," Hosiah said as he continued to the door, opening it further. "How did the meeting?" "Hi." Hosiah's mother stood in the hallway, just across the threshold into his father's room. It had been just barely a year since he'd seen her, and the last time it hadn't been on good terms. Hosiah gripped the doorknob, and his shoulders tensed, squaring and giving him an extra inch of height. "Can I help you?" I want to see Norman." Hosiah stared at her, debating her request. He glanced down the hallways before back at his mother who, in all fairness, looked good. She looked like her old self, the mother he remembered from childhood. Her face had gained some weight, and her cheeks were round and full again. Her mahogany skin glistened in the warm nursing home lights, and she smelled again like flowers and fresh bread. "Fine," he mumbled and opened the door further, stepping out of the way and ushering her inside. "Dad, you have a surprise visitor today." "Do I?" Hosiah led his mother down the shallow hallway. "Yeah, you do," his mother said when she fully entered the room. Her shoulders had been tense and her eyes worried, but when she laid eyes on her husband, all of it melted away. He smiled at her. "Hello, pretty lady, it's nice to see you." His mother's cheeks darkened and she looked away, bashful and ashamed at the same time. "Hello, Norman. You look very handsome," she ventured. "Thank you," he replied, stretching his hand palm up towards her. "Please come join me. I've missed the love of my life." Her blush didn't fade, but she obeyed him, approaching the side of his bed and fitting her hand in his. He kissed her hand, rubbing pale cheeks over her skin. "This is the second best day of my life," he whispered against her skin. "What was the first?" she said, giggling at his antics. "The first was the day I first laid eyes on you and knew you would be my wife." Despite all the bubbling resentment he had for his mother, he couldn't help but smile at his father's comment. All he had ever truly wanted in a relationship was for someone to look at him the same way his father looked at his mother. She was full of shortcomings and flaws, but he still looked at her like she was the image of perfection, like there were no other women on the planet. Tears came to his eyes as he watched them. She had now settled on the corner of his bed, and they were talking as if no time had passed between them. "Hey. What's up?" Hosiah jumped. "Brody." "Hi," Brody grinned and kissed Hosiah's cheek. "How are you?" "My mother's here," Hosiah said, pushing Brody back a few inches after the kiss. "Okay, and we should be polite." "I am being polite," Brody replied. "I wanted to kiss you straight up and grab your ass." Hosiah blinked. Okay. Brody chuckled, stealing another kiss before passing Hosiah and approaching Hosiah's father's bed. How you doing, Mr. Norman? He offered a fist to Hosiah's father, and once the exchange had been completed, he turned to Hosiah's mother. And you must be Mrs. Moore? You can call me Lynette, she said as Brody took her hand and charmingly touched the backs of her fingers with his lips. She giggled. I've heard so many good things about you. It's nice to finally have the pleasure of meeting you. I'm Brody, or Vincent Ambrose Johnson III. Everyone calls me Brody, though. He smiled. I'm a friend of your son's. A friend? His mother lifted an eyebrow. Yes, Hosiah snapped. A friend. Brody chuckled and winked at Hosiah's mother. A friend, he says. Then he looked back at Hosiah's father. Hey, big man. Did Hosiah tell you the good news yet? The nurses say we can take you to the house for the weekend. We've got everything ready to go. We just need you to get your shoes on, old man. Really? Hosiah's father looked at Hosiah. Yes, really. I was waiting to tell you until Brody got here, but yes, you get to come see my place for the weekend. That's wonderful news, Hosiah's mother said, squeezing his father's shoulder. Will you be there too, lovey? No. I'm just visiting for today. She squeezed his shoulder again. But I will see you Monday as soon as you get back. Norman frowned but nodded. I will be ready to go when my wife is ready, he explained. Yes, sir, Brody said, patting the man's shoulder and then wandering back over to Hosiah. How'd the parole meeting go? Hosiah asked in a low whisper. Fine, Brody started, unloading all the finer details about the parole meeting and the rest of his day as Hosiah's parents got to know each other again. 2 hours later, they were finally packed up and leaving. Hosiah's mother caught the bus away from the nursing home, and Brody, Hosiah, and Hosiah's father piled into Brody's car and went to Hosiah's place. His apartment had barely enough space for one person. 3 people made it feel cramped, even with the best spatial design techniques, but even though it was a game of Tetris to get his father inside and settled, Hosiah wouldn't have changed it for the world. Hosiah was happy. His heart was full and bursting at the seams to have both the men he loved at his place for the weekend.